Sophie didn't ask for much. Not after the hospital visit started and the long nights filled with machines beeping and quiet whispers in the hallway. She was only 6, but she already knew that not all kids got better. Still, she smiled a lot, not because she wasn't scared, but because she didn't want her mom to cry again. One afternoon, 2 kind women from Make-A-Wish came to see her at the Children's Hospital in Toronto. They sat on colorful chairs beside her bed and asked, "If you could do anything in the world, what would it be?" Sophie thought for a moment. She didn't ask to meet a celebrity or go to Disneyland. Instead, she looked up with her big brown eyes and said, "I want to see the Royal Guards in London, the ones who wear the red jackets and the fuzzy black hats." The room went quiet for a second. The women smiled gently, a little surprised. "That's a very special wish," one of them said. "They never smile," Sophie added. "But maybe if I wave really nicely, one of them will wave back." Her parents glanced at each other, both trying not to cry. It was such a small wish and yet so big at the same time. A few weeks later, after some calls, some planning, and a lot of hope, Sophie's family was packing their bags. Doctors gave them the green light for a short trip. They said her treatment would pause just long enough for her to travel safely, as long as she rested and stayed warm. On the plane, Sophie sat by the window with her teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, tucked under her arm. She didn't care about movies or snacks. She just kept looking at the clouds, wondering how tall the guards would be. "Do you think they're taller than Daddy?" she asked. Her dad laughed. "They might be, especially with those big hats." When they landed in London, it was early morning. Cold air wrapped around them as they stepped out of the airport. Sophie wore a red coat that almost matched the uniform she'd been dreaming about. Her mom had packed it just for this. As they drove through the city, Sophie pressed her face against the window. Red buses, old buildings, and people in long coats rushed past. But all she wanted to see was the palace, the place where the guards stood still like statues, like superheroes in uniforms. Her parents had planned the visit for the next morning, giving Sophie time to rest, but she barely slept that night. Excitement bubbled up in her chest, stronger than any medicine. "What if they really don't move at all?" she whispered in the dark, snuggled up beside her mom. "Then we'll wave anyway," her mom said, brushing hair from her daughter's forehead, "because even if they don't move, they'll still see you. And that's enough." Sophie smiled and closed her eyes, dreaming of tall guards, shiny boots, and a little wave that might just change everything. The next morning, the sky over London was gray and soft, like a giant blanket covering the city. Sophie didn't care about the clouds or the cold. She was too excited. They had breakfast at a small hotel near Buckingham Palace. The toast was too dry, and the eggs were a little cold, but Sophie ate them anyway. Her eyes kept going to the window. "Are we going soon?" she asked between bites. Her dad checked his watch. "Just a few more minutes, kiddo. We want to be there before the changing of the guard." Sophie didn't know what that meant exactly, but it sounded important. She nodded and hugged Mr. Buttons tight. He had a red ribbon now. Her mom had tied it around his neck to match Sophie's coat. When they stepped outside, the cold air bit at Sophie's cheeks, but she didn't complain. The streets buzzed with people, some rushing to work, others taking photos. Red buses passed by, and black taxis honked their horns. It was loud and busy, but Sophie was focused. As they walked closer to the palace, crowds started to gather near the gates. Some people had cameras. Others had little British flags. Sophie, holding her dad's hand, looked through the black bars of the palace fence and saw them. The royal guards. They were just like in the pictures, tall, serious, and standing perfectly still in their red coats and black furry hats. One of them was standing just a few feet from the gate, staring straight ahead. He didn't blink. He didn't move. "Wow," Sophie whispered. "He looks like a statue." Her mom knelt beside her. "They trained for years to do this. They're very strong and very focused." Sophie nodded slowly, eyes wide. "Do you think they get bored?" Her dad laughed a little. "Maybe, but they're guarding something very special, so they take it seriously." Sophie walked up as close to the gate as she could, her tiny fingers gripping the cold metal. She didn't say a word. She just stared at the guard, and he didn't move, not even a little bit. Some tourists around her were trying to make the guards laugh. They waved, made silly faces, even shouted a little, but the guards didn't react. Not at all. Sophie didn't try anything like that. She just stood there quietly, watching. After a few minutes, she took a deep breath and gave a small, shy wave. Her mitten hand moved slowly back and forth, just once. She knew the rule. The guards weren't supposed to respond. But something told her, maybe, just maybe, today would be different. And in that moment, surrounded by strangers and noise and cold, Sophie's world felt still, just like the guard she was hoping would see her. It was strange how quiet it felt with all those people around. The crowd was filled with tourists, some speaking in different languages, others snapping photos of the palace. But Sophie only had eyes for the royal guard in front of her. He was tall, standing completely still, his eyes looking straight ahead, his hands firmly holding his rifle. "Why don't they move?" Sophie asked, her voice a little more curious now than before. Her dad crouched down beside her, still holding Mr. Buttons in one hand. "It's part of their job," he explained. "The guards stand still because they're protecting something very important. It's a rule they follow. It's their duty." "A rule?" Sophie frowned. "So they can't break it?" "Nope, not even for a second," her dad said with a grin. "They don't smile. They don't talk. They just stand there, keeping watch." Her mom added, "They have to stay focused. It's a very serious job." Sophie nodded slowly, but her eyes never left the guard. She couldn't imagine standing like that all day, not even moving a little bit. It seemed impossible. "Do you think he gets tired?" she asked quietly. "Probably," her mom said, "but that's why they train so hard. They need to be able to stand still no matter what's happening around them." Her mom looked over at the other guards, who were also standing perfectly still at different spots along the palace gates. They all looked the same, serious, tall, and unmoving. "I think they're like statues," Sophie said after a moment, "but better, because they're real." "You're right," her dad smiled. "Real statues would be boring." There was a small laugh in the crowd. Some people were taking pictures of the guards, trying to catch them off guard with funny poses. But the guards didn't even blink. They didn't move a muscle. Sophie didn't mind. She didn't expect anything to change. After all, she knew the rules now. These guards weren't like regular people. They were part of a long tradition, a symbol of something much bigger than any one person. "I bet they don't even get to talk to anyone," Sophie said. Her mom shook her head. "It's all about focus. They can't get distracted." Sophie thought about that for a moment. The idea of standing still and never talking, never laughing, never breaking character, it seemed a little lonely, but also kind of cool, like being part of something really important. "Do you think they ever want to wave at someone?" Sophie asked, her voice soft. Her dad chuckled. "Maybe they do, but they can't. That's the rule." Sophie watched the guard again. She was starting to understand, but still, something about the stillness felt like it wasn't the whole story. Surely, a person couldn't just stand there all day, no matter how important their job was. Surely, they had a heart too. And as she thought about this, she gave the guard another little wave, just as quietly as before. Maybe he wouldn't notice. Maybe he wouldn't react at all. But she didn't care. This time it felt like the right thing to do. The crowd around Sophie shifted, but she stayed where she was, her eyes locked on the royal guard in front of her. Everything around her seemed to blur out, like the world had become smaller, quieter, and all that mattered was this moment. The guard, the man in the red jacket and tall black hat, was still standing perfectly still, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Not a single inch of his posture changed. Her heart beat a little faster as she looked up at him. She wasn't sure why, but she felt connected to him somehow. Maybe it was because he looked so serious, so calm, like he had an important job to do, and nothing at all, could make him break his focus. But then she thought about something her mom had said earlier. Sometimes it's okay to break the rules. Sophie bit her lip, unsure. She didn't want to get anyone in trouble, especially not the guard. But the longer she watched him, the more she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could do something small, something that might change things for just a second. With a deep breath, Sophie slowly lifted her mittened hand. She didn't wave big or dramatic, just a gentle, soft wave. Her fingers moved back and forth once, like she was waving to someone far away. Her eyes stayed on the guard, hoping he'd notice her, even for just a second. She wasn't expecting much. After all, the guards never reacted. They never waved back. Everyone knew that. Sophie had heard the stories. People would try everything, from funny faces to loud noises, but the guards wouldn't move. But something inside her said to try anyway. Maybe he'd see her. Maybe this time would be different. A few moments passed, and she felt her hand slowly lower back to her side. Sophie turned to her parents, her heart a little heavier now. "I guess he didn't see me," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. But just as she was about to look away, something caught her attention. The guard's posture shifted, just a little, his head tilted down, his eyes moving toward her. It was small, barely noticeable, but for a split second she swore he saw her. And then, in a move so subtle, so quiet, that no one else seemed to notice, the guard lowered his rifle ever so slightly. He nodded. It wasn't a huge gesture. It wasn't a smile. But it was enough. It was as if the world paused for just that moment, and in that pause, something magical happened. Sophie gasped. Her eyes widened, and her hand flew to her mouth in surprise. Did that really happen? Did he actually just acknowledge her? "Mom, Dad." Sophie tugged on their sleeves, excitement bubbling in her voice. "He saw me. He saw me wave." Her parents turned, confusion flashing across their faces at first. They hadn't seen the guard's small gesture, but when they looked back at Sophie's face, glowing with joy, they couldn't help but smile. It was as if the entire day had shifted. Sophie's heart raced. She hadn't expected anything to happen. She didn't think the guard would even blink. But in that tiny moment, when the guard's eyes met hers, she felt like anything was possible. And that tiny, quiet acknowledgement made her feel braver than she ever had before. The world around them kept moving, but for Sophie, time stood still in that one beautiful second. The seconds after the guard nodded felt like they stretched on forever. Sophie stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes locked on him. She could hardly believe what had just happened. Had he really seen her? Had he really broken the rules, even just for a second? She couldn't stop looking at him. The guard was still standing straight, looking forward, like nothing had changed. But Sophie knew. She knew that something had shifted. Around them, the crowd continued to buzz, taking photos and chatting. But to Sophie, everything else faded away. There was only her, the guard, and that brief moment of connection. "Did you see that, Mom? Dad?" Sophie whispered, still a little out of breath. Her mom glanced at the guard, then at Sophie. She wasn't sure what had happened, but she saw the pure joy on her daughter's face. "I saw something, honey," she said gently, "but it was so fast. Are you sure he saw you?" "I'm sure." Sophie's voice was filled with excitement. He looked down and nodded, just like I waved. "He saw me." Her dad smiled, a little chuckle escaping his lips. "Well, kiddo, maybe he just wanted to let you know he noticed." Sophie couldn't stop grinning. It was like a secret shared between her and the royal guard, a silent bond no one else understood. The world around her continued on, but in that moment, she felt as if time had stopped. And then something strange happened. The guard, who had been standing like a statue for so long, shifted again. Not a lot, but enough to catch the attention of a few people around. He moved just a little to the side, as though he was adjusting himself. At first, Sophie thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was adjusting his posture. Maybe his legs were tired from standing so still for so long. But then, a few seconds later, the guard raised his rifle and brought it to his side in a casual position, breaking his rigid stance. It wasn't dramatic, but it was a change from his usual stillness. For a moment, the crowd paused. No one really knew what to make of it, but Sophie's eyes were wide. She felt like she had just witnessed something extraordinary. The guard didn't break into a smile, and he didn't wave back. But for that 1 second, it was as though he was giving her a small gift, an acknowledgement that her wave had been seen, that she mattered. "Wow," Sophie whispered, still in awe. "He really saw me." Her dad bent down to her level. "You know, sometimes people surprise us. They show kindness when we least expect it." Sophie nodded, her excitement still bubbling up inside. She was so proud of that small moment, so proud of herself for daring to wave at the guard. It didn't matter that the whole world hadn't seen it. To her, it was the most important thing that had happened all day. The crowd around them began to move again, the noise of the city picking up as people kept snapping photos, laughing, and talking. But for Sophie, it felt like nothing could ever be as special as what had just happened between her and the guard. That quiet nod, that tiny shift in the air, was a moment she would never forget. The crowd around Sophie had already begun to disperse, but she didn't want to leave. Not yet. She stayed there, watching the guard, her heart still racing from the tiny moment they'd shared. She kept thinking about how he had looked down at her, just for that brief second. It felt like a secret between them, something only the two of them knew. Her parents were starting to move toward the exit, but Sophie couldn't take her eyes off the guard. He was back to standing perfectly still, his gaze forward, his posture as stiff as before. Everything about him was the same, except for that one little change. "Come on, sweetie," her mom said softly, noticing that Sophie hadn't moved. "It's time to go. We don't want to miss our next stop." But Sophie shook her head, not ready to leave just yet. She wanted to hold on to this moment a little longer, wanted to remember how she felt when the guard had nodded at her. "Just a few more minutes," she said quietly. Her dad smiled and nodded. "All right, kiddo, we'll wait with you." The three of them stood there for a while longer, just watching. People continued to walk past, some in a hurry, others pausing for photos. But Sophie felt like she was in a bubble, a world where only she and the guard existed. It was strange how something so small could mean so much. She had waved, not expecting anything at all, and yet something had happened. She hadn't just been another tourist in a crowd. For a moment, she had been seen. "I bet he's really tired," Sophie said after a long pause, breaking the silence. "Standing still all day must be hard." "I'm sure it's not easy," her dad agreed. "But it's his job, and he's very good at it." Her mom added, "And he does it because he's protecting something very important." Sophie nodded. "I understand. It's like he's guarding something even bigger than him." "Exactly," her dad said, giving her a proud smile. "And that's what makes it so special. It's about being part of something much bigger." Sophie's eyes flicked back to the guard. She thought about how serious he looked, how still he stood, and how much he had to focus. But she also thought about how, just for a moment, he had looked at her. And that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, the rules weren't everything. Maybe a little kindness could still break through, even in the quietest of places. The guard didn't smile. He didn't wave. But that little shift, just the slightest movement, had been enough to remind Sophie that even in the most still, rigid moments, there was always room for a little light. The moment passed, and the crowd began to move more quickly now. Sophie finally looked away from the guard and took her parents' hands. "I'm ready," she said softly. They walked away together, but Sophie couldn't stop smiling. She felt lighter than she had in a long time, as if that small, quiet moment had filled her heart in a way she hadn't expected. And in the back of her mind, she knew that she would carry that memory forever of a little girl who waved, and a royal guard who saw her. Sophie didn't want to leave London. The city had felt like a dream, full of new sights and sounds. But what stayed with her the most was that moment at the palace. She couldn't stop thinking about the guard, the way he'd looked down at her, that tiny nod, as if he had recognized something in her. To Sophie, it felt like the most magical moment of her life, even if no one else had seen it. The next morning, they packed their bags and got ready to head back home. Sophie's mom had been gentle with her, saying it was time to go, but Sophie wasn't ready. She wanted more time in that magical world, the one where the rules could be bent just a little. On the flight back, Sophie sat by the window, her head pressed against the cool glass. The clouds below them were soft and white, like cotton candy. She stared at them, lost in thought. "Do you think he'll remember me?" Sophie asked quietly, her fingers tracing little patterns on the window. "Who?" her dad asked, glancing up from his magazine. "The guard," Sophie said, her voice soft but hopeful. "Do you think he'll remember the little girl who waved at him?" Her dad smiled, his eyes warm. "I think that moment will stay with you, sweetie. You might not ever see him again, but you'll always carry that memory, and that's pretty special, don't you think?" Sophie thought about it for a moment. "Yeah, I guess so." They flew over cities, rivers, and fields, and slowly the excitement of the trip began to fade, replaced by the familiar feeling of going home. But Sophie still kept the guard in her heart. She liked to imagine that he was still standing there, guarding the palace, remembering the little girl who waved. Back home, everything felt the same. The same walls, the same toys, the same old house. But Sophie wasn't the same. She carried with her the quiet understanding that sometimes the world wasn't all about rules. Sometimes there was room for small moments of kindness, like the one she'd shared with the guard. At school the next week, Sophie sat at her desk, doodling in her notebook as the teacher talked about math. Her mind wandered back to London. She thought about the city, the palace, and the stillness of the guards. But most of all, she thought about that small wave. Sophie raised her hand in class, her mind still far away from the lesson. "Can I tell you something?" she asked the teacher. "Of course, Sophie," the teacher replied, a smile on her face. "I went to London and saw the royal guards," Sophie said. "And I waved at one of them. And he saw me. I think he remembered me." The class fell silent for a moment. Then a few of the kids laughed, and Sophie's teacher smiled. "That sounds like a very special experience, Sophie. You know, sometimes the smallest gestures can mean the most." Sophie smiled, her heart full. She had a secret now, one that no one else knew. A quiet moment shared with the royal guard, a moment that lasted forever in her heart, and that was enough. Months passed since Sophie's trip to London, but the memory of that day stayed with her. She would think back to the royal guard whenever she needed a reminder that small acts of kindness could make a big difference. Even though no one else had seen what happened, she knew. She carried it with her like a little secret, a quiet treasure that no one could take away. One afternoon, Sophie's family went to the park. The air was crisp and the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees. Sophie ran ahead, laughing as she chased her dad. She felt a little wind on her face and couldn't help but think about how different everything felt now. It wasn't just the guard. It wasn't just the trip to London. It was something inside her, a feeling that maybe the world wasn't always as rigid as it seemed. Sometimes a small wave, a quiet moment, could change everything. "Race you to the swings," Sophie shouted, looking back at her dad. He grinned and started to jog after her. "You're on, kiddo." They both ran toward the swings, laughing together. Sophie was faster, though, and reached the swings first. She gripped the chains and swung herself up high, feeling the wind in her hair. "This is just like flying," she said, her voice full of joy. Her dad pushed her gently, making her swing higher. "Feels good, huh?" "Yeah, but it's like flying with a purpose," she said, laughing, like a royal guard, standing still but always knowing what's important. Her dad paused, looking at her with a puzzled smile. "A royal guard?" "Yeah," Sophie said, her face lighting up with excitement. "It's like the guard, standing still, knowing what matters, but also remembering that even the smallest wave can make a difference. Just like when I waved at that guard." Her dad raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised. "You really think that moment made a difference?" "I know it did," she said, nodding confidently. "It made a difference to me, and maybe even to him. Sometimes, even when no one else sees it, the little things are what count." Her dad smiled, ruffling her hair. "You're wise beyond your years, you know that." Sophie just grinned, swinging even higher. She felt free, like she could do anything. She knew she had carried that lesson with her from London, that even in the quietest moments, there could be meaning. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the park, Sophie slowed down on the swing, her feet gently touching the ground. She stood up and looked around, feeling content. "I think the guard would be proud," she said to herself, more to the wind than anyone else. And in that moment, Sophie realized something. Sometimes the world might feel full of rules and seriousness, like those guards at the palace. But just like her wave, it was the little things, the small acts of kindness, the moments of connection that made the world feel a little brighter. Sophie smiled, feeling like the guard's nod had taught her something important. A little wave could last forever, and sometimes that was all you needed.